Peace, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Real Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Tehran, and as always, I'm joined by my brilliant co host, Roxana. The guest we have today, I'm sure, needs no introduction, but for those of our audience who are new to what we do on Skeps Islamica, we are pleased to welcome the Crowley Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Notre Dame, Gabriel Said Reynolds, to talk about his latest publication, Christianity and the Quran: The Rise of Islam in Christian Arabia. Thank you for joining us, Professor Reynolds. We're thrilled to have you.
I'm so happy to be here. Good to see you again, Taryn. Very glad to be with you as well, Roxana.
Yeah, we've been wanting to have you on for a long time, and the recent publication was a great segue to bring you on. So we have a lot of questions concerning your recent book, so let's dive in. Our first question, what was your immediate impetus for writing this book, and to what extent does it build on your previous work?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about the book. I'll try not to, do too much promotion of the book and we'll get right to some of the issues. I mean, the book emerged from some of the earlier work I've done on Qur'an and Bible, and essentially it's a response to the common notion that Christians, or at least kind of mainstream standard Christians in late antiquity, so the time of the rise of Islam, seventh century, early seventh century, that they weren't around basically as the early Islamic community developed. They were in far off places, maybe Jerusalem, Egypt, Damascus, Ethiopia, but they weren't really around. So the Quran is not engaging with kind of neighbors of the believing community, but in a sort of abstract way. And that's just not my take on the Quran. I see the Quran sort of directly engaging with a community that's living among the believers. And so, yeah, I mean, that's an idea that's been in the back of my head for a long time. And I finally thought, let's just like boldly go forward and make an argument about that.
Yeah, it is a
Um,
very
okay, go ahead, Tom.
no, go ahead. It's all you.
I was just going to ask, in your opening chapter, in which you do like a survey of previous scholarship, which is actually very useful, to understand the relationship between Christianity and the Quran, you focus a lot on the work of Richard Bell,
Yes.
um, and which I found very fascinating because I was very unfamiliar with his work. Why does his work act as a useful foil for the conclusions you develop in the book?
Yeah, great question, Roxanne. And 100% it's a foil. I mean, it's kind of unfair for Richard Bell. I mean, it passed away many decades ago. I don't know exactly when. I mean, I think his book, The Rise of Islam in Christian Arabia, no, The Origins of Islam, something like that in Christian Arabia, or in its Arabian environment, it's about 100 years old now. So some people have criticized me being like, can't you pick on someone that's like still alive who could respond to you? So fair enough. And, I'm not the only one that's used Bell as a foil. So he kind of represents a sort of scholarship that a lot of people would classify as Orientalist, not really in the bad kind of like racist Islamophobic sense of Orientalist, just kind of like old school approach. And it's that kind of old school approach that, yeah, acts as a foil. So essentially, Richard Bell thinks, Muhammad is the author of the Quran. He's not a Muslim, so it's not divinely inspired. But there's also nothing kind of crazy, revisionist, multiple authors, or something like this, or hidden Christian meanings. Muhammad is the author, and the task of the scholar basically is to sort of kind of walk with Muhammad through, the years 610 to 632, and in the Quran, sort of see what was going on in Muhammad's sort of community. And that's the way to understand the Quran, to sort of, have this kind of biographical approach to the Quran. But he also goes further than that too. And a lot of kind of the old school Orientalists did, which was, he felt that you could sort of understand kind of the inner world, like the mental life of Muhammad. And so there's like a psychologizing that goes on, like, oh, this or that verse sort of shows pessimism about the ability to convert the unbelievers because Muhammad, he just was like kind of down on himself at this point. So there's that dimension as well. So both kind of the biographical way in which he approaches the text, Mecca, Medina, 610 to 632, looking at all the reports of Islamic tradition, and the sort of psychologizing, this utter confidence that he can know that what was going on with the prophet. So, I sort of disagree with both of those approaches, and so he was a perfect kind of victim of my critical academic take.
All right, and you highlight how Bell's Protestantism might have shaped his scholarship on the Quran. How difficult is it, in your view, for scholars working in religious studies to prevent their personal faith commitments from impacting their work?
Yeah, it's totally difficult. Yeah, great point, Terrence. So, yeah, it's impossible. So, I'm a Catholic. Many people know that. I'm sure it comes through in a million ways. For Bell's Protestantism, there's a couple of ways where I think this shows through. And, for the most part, kind of this generation of scholarship, I mean, famously, Abraham Geiger, right? He writes a book in 1830, and he was a Jew who was at kind of the origins of the Reformed Jewish movement. So he's an exception. There's some other Jewish scholars like Heinrich Speyer, but there are lots of Protestants like Noeldeke himself, and then Richard Bell, and then his disciple, also Scottish, William Montgomery Watt. Also, I think they're both clergymen, in addition. So, yeah, I mean, the Protestantism with Bell, in part, there's a certain view of the history of the church, sort of like, classical Protestant view is things were kind of good in the earliest community around Jesus. The accounts that we have in the book of the Acts of the Apostles about, the community sort of preaching the word, living together in community, this idea that, like the religious life of the first Christians was simple and pure, and then it all became decadent and corrupt with basically imperial Christianity. He would affirm kind of the classic church councils. So he wasn't like that revisionist I mean, most Protestants are not. So still he would affirm like the Nicene Creed, which comes from 325, but he'd be very critical of Eastern Christianity. So, what we recognize as Orthodoxy or Catholicism, with its liturgical life and saints and Marian devotion. And so there's this idea, I'm sorry, I'll finish, I'll wrap this up quick, but there's this idea basically that, almost it's going to be a caricature again of Richard Bell a bit, but like there's almost this vibe of, oh, if the prophet had met kind of simple, pure apostolic Christians, um, like him, he might be thinking it's really unfair to him, but then things would have been different, right? But unfortunately, the only Christians he could encounter were either like heretics out in the desert or just kind of the decadent, corrupt Eastern church with all of its rituals and saints and all of this. So, I mean, that comes through that in his depiction both of Eastern Christianity and of kind of the story of the prophet's encounter with Christians.
And why do you find it, one thing that you're writing against in your book is
Mhm.
you talk about against the idea that some elements of the Quran's characterization of Christianity can be explained by this idea of heretical Christian sects in the region. Why do you find that sort of hypothesis not at all historically compelling? And how has the idea posited by scholars like Bell that Arabia is the sort of womb of heresies, how has that hampered scholarship on the Quran in your view?
Yeah, it's a really important point. Thanks for picking up on that, Roxana. So, yeah, I mean, this is like a totally central idea among not just, so in this case, it's not just kind of old school Orientalists, but still today, I mean, you find this all over the place in Islamic studies scholarship, that, bits in the Quran which engage with Christian ideas or criticize Christian ideas, or like on the other hand, the Quran's own doctrines reflect the presence of heretical Christian communities that were in Arabia. So there's a couple of things behind that. Uh, One is this notion that Arabia would have just been a perfect place for heretics to kind of hang out. So there's this kind of assumption that really it's really just an assumption, like it's not really evidence based, but it's logical, right? This idea that within sort of like the central lands of the Byzantine Empire, the official church would have kind of stamped out any heresies, right? So any sort of extreme views of Christ, either like elevating him too much or denying his divinity, or other views about Mary, whatever, like inside the Central Lands, they would have been stamped out. Like they would have been persecuted and they wouldn't have survived. So maybe they took refuge in a place like the Hejaz, Western Arabia, sort of beyond the reach of the imperial stormtroopers or whatever. Right. So there's that notion. And yeah, and then we have this famous phrase which you cited there that Arabia was the womb of heresies, which I could speak about as well, that phrase in particular. Um, anyway, a key point in just thinking through this is beginning to define what is meant by this term, heresies or heretical Christianity. There's a lot to be said here. I don't want to go on and on. So I'll just say a word or two, and if you want to follow up, Roxana. So I mean, it's just important to keep in mind that the development of the early church is marked first by the Council of Nicaea in 325, where it's affirmed against Arius that the Son of God is homoousios, or one in substance with God the Father. So there's just one divine substance. Whereas Arius sort of saw the Son of God as kind of a lower stage of divinity and not of the same substance of God the Father. And then a second council in 451, which defined the incarnate Son of God, so Jesus, as having two natures, both divine and human. So, I mean, those are kind of the central doctrines. And you kind of have to start there in beginning to think, okay, what does it even mean to say heretical Christianity? A lot more could be said about that. In the way, just a final point here, the way that people usually sort of start kind of running with this idea of heresies in the Quran, it's not actually kind of a careful academic examination of, say, the Eastern Church. It's usually to pick up on one phrase in the Quran. So famously, for example, at the end of Surah Al-Ma'idah, in verse 116, the Quran has God speak to Jesus and say, "Did you say to the people to take yourself?" Well, it's a quotation, so take me. So take yourself and Mary as two gods apart from God. So people just focus on that one phrase, like a laser focus on that one phrase. And they would say, wait, this implies that there were Christians that deified Mary. It also implies that the Trinity sort of at stake here is not Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but is instead God, Jesus, and Mary, kind of family Trinity. And then they're sort of off to the races, like, okay, what Christian heresy might have had a sort of Mary as a goddess or this kind of interesting take on the Trinity? And they start reading books and like desperately trying to find them. So that approach of kind of, it's like, those school exams where you had to draw a line, at least in the US, we had them, term primary, draw a line to match, what is the right definition of such word or whatever. Like they're trying to connect that one verse with some Christian heresy. And I just think that's kind of a simplistic way to approach it.
And although pre-Islamic poetry has been frequently employed as a historical source in recent scholarship by academics like Nikolai Salini, Peter Webb, and Ilka Lindsted, and also Nathaniel Miller,
Right.
you choose not to use it in your work. Why do you doubt its utility and authenticity?
Yeah, another big topic. So are there easy questions coming after this?
I hope so.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, a huge topic, and it's kind of like a sensitive topic in some ways. I mean, famously, folks may know the story of Taha Hussein, the Egyptian scholar who, at the beginning of the 20th century, famously wrote a book called On the Jahili Poetry, on the pre-Islamic poetry, in
And
which he
for a long
is.
time, that's actually his take is what I believed. And so I'm pretty shocked to see scholarship coming from another direction with it.
Yeah, definitely. Like, there's definitely been a response. I totally agree, Taryn, in the past 10, 20 years, sort of recovering the authenticity of the pre-Islamic poetry or Jahili poetry and sort of insisting that it's an indispensable kind of set of data for reading the Quran. More than that, also like for understanding the world of the earliest Muslim community, right? So, Nikolai Sinai, brilliant scholar, has that, short book where he kind of speaks about the presentation of Allah in the pre-Islamic poetry and makes a case that a careful reading will sort of identify authentic bits in the poetry that can be useful for setting the scene. I mean, that's a good thing to do. It's totally reasonable, coherent. He's a super careful scholar. People do this in New Testament scholarship, right? They would say, like in my department here at Notre Dame, the New Testament folks here would say, listen, if you want to read the New Testament, you can't just read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John or whatever. You need to like paint a picture of the world of the first century Eastern Mediterranean. That means understanding kind of the pagan Roman elements. What was that world like? Also, Second Temple Judaism in that context, right? So something analogous is going on there. Uh, so the principal problem is there's not a single line of poetry which we have from a text written before Islam. It's all written down by Muslims, oftentimes centuries later. People make the case that, well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's inauthentic. I don't remember someone making this case, but if I wanted to defend it, I would say Homer's poetry, for example, I think is recorded centuries later, but through careful, whatever, philological study, you can see that it's actually coming from whatever the dates of Homer are. I have no idea. So yeah, there is a case made, but there's a second problem, which is there's a kind of circular logic here, which is, you have in the pre-Islamic poetry like Umayyah ibn Abi Salt is the most famous example. This Quranic flavored language. Someone even wrote a book, a French guy, I think his name was Ouart or something, in the late 19th century called A New Source for the Quran, Une Nouvelle Source. And he was focusing on Umayyah's poetry. And he's like, there's all this Quranic flavored stuff here. This is great. Like, he's referring to things like Hud and Saleh. I think Jebel Judi, the mountain, according to the Quran, where Noah's Ark landed. He's like, this is great. Like, we now see where the Quran is sort of drawing references from. But the problem is, other scholars come back and they're like, dude, like, those are precisely the signs that this is actually post-Quranic, composed or at least edited by a Muslim, whose mind has all these Quranic references. So there's a circular thing there. So it's very difficult to work with. Uh, you know, I don't know, Nikolai and others, you mentioned Nathan, great scholars like Nathaniel Miller and others, Ilke Lindstedt. Yeah, they might be right. I might be wrong. I mean, I think at least it's problematic and it's kind of, for me, safer to stay away from it.
Yeah, that still seemed to be kind of a minefield, although with recent scholarship, a little bit more clarification on the poetry
Hmm.
has, come to
Hmm.
light.
Hmm.
And your attitude towards sources is very careful in your book, and in relation to that, you don't use early Muslims or Islamic sources as a basis for your argument, like the Constitution of Medina, the Sirah literature, the Ura corpus, and they all depict quite a strong Jewish presence in the
Hmm.
Hijaz, but not
Hmm.
but not a Christian one.
Hmm.
And so obviously you don't believe that these sources paint an accurate picture of the Hijazi religious community because your argument is that, there was a much larger Christian presence in that region. So what motivations do you think that later Muslims might have had to erase a majority Christian presence, but actually not erase the presence of the Jewish tribes, for example, in Medina?
Yeah, great question. Another tough one. So,
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you had
yeah,
so many interviews on this on your book that we tried to, especially Roxana made the attempt to try to come with
yeah.
something.
This
Uh,
is like next level though. This is yeah. I'm glad I had some warm-ups with other talks. So, yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is important to point out, just to sort of step back and maybe just make an observation about like the direction of current scholarship in Islamic studies. So principally kind of in the academic university world is there is an over in my humble opinion, there is an overwhelming sort of a trend towards recovering authentic data from the Islamic sources. That's sort of again, people may disagree with me on this, but like the people who can say, no, this is authentic or that's authentic, and I can show it. So, for example, like in some of the hadith work, by Schöller and Goethe and those guys, like people who can show it, like that's the kind of stuff that gets a lot of accolades, right? Like the people who are sort of on their own at a conference sipping coffee in a corner are the folks who are like skeptical and saying like actually like I don't think this stuff is reliable. So there is like I don't know if it's not exactly what you're asking, Roxana, but I just think like that's kind of interesting to me. Scholarship goes up and down. There once was a time, where the vibe was very, very different in like the days of Bell and stuff. Other stuff was going on. It's interesting for me being in a Catholic university, a theology department. There's two of us doing Islamic studies and like 300 doing Christian theology. Like in biblical studies, at least in New Testament studies, the vibe is like totally different. Like a young scholar is kind of commended and praised if they can kind of deconstruct sort of simplistic traditional confessional ideas about Paul or the Gospel of Luke or whatever. So, anyway, I just thought I'd mention that because you mentioned the Orwell corpus, Sean Anthony, who's a very critical scholar. He's not in any way an apologist, but in his recent book, I forget the name, he's like, listen, Patricia Crona said, you've got this Islamic material about the early community, and you have to accept it or reject it, but you can't work with it. I think that was her phrase, right? And then Sean in his book is like, no, no, you actually can work with it. I'm going to show you how. And then he investigates the Orwell letters as well, the Abdurazak and the letters attributed to Orwell and all this stuff. So, yeah, okay. But you asked about Judaism and Christianity. Should I just carry on and get
Yeah,
to
go
that?
ahead. Go,
Yeah,
go,
sure,
go,
yeah.
go.
Okay.
Like, I would love to know why you think a Jewish presence was preserved in these sources, but a Christian presence w wasn't.
Right, right. Terrific. So, um, the first point is that the Quran, in my opinion, we'll probably circle back to this, but there are signs that it's engaging directly with Christians. So you have verses where the Quran is challenging Christians directly. So, Quran and Surah An-Nisa, O people of the book, don't exaggerate in your religion. That verse is not about Jews and Christians. It's about Christians. It says, do not say three. It makes statements about Christ explicitly, but it's addressed, right, rhetorically, second person plural, O people of the book, la taghlu fi dinikum. Do not exaggerate in your religion. And then you have verses which counsel the Muslims on how they should debate with Jews and Christians. But again, I think it's pretty clearly Christians in Surah Al-Ankabut, so Surah 29. Don't debate with the people of the book except in the best manner. It goes on from there. So they're just signs like that which tell me that there's a living Christian community among the new Muslim believers. Now, your question is, if that's the case, like why does the tradition tell all these stories about Jewish tribes in Medina, but Christians, it's just a few individuals?
Mhm.
I mean, to answer that, I guess I would have to step back and just speak more generally about the biographical literature, the chronicles and other Islamic sources which speak about the earliest Islamic community. I think there's a lot going on there. That literature is in part exegetical. So, a part is developing, especially things in Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran, where there's a lot of emphasis about the Quran addressing the Jews, and there's certain references which seem to be alluding to specific conflicts with Banu Israel. So that dimension, I think, loomed really large in the way the story of the early community was told. And then a more important point is the way in which the whole idea of the Jews rejecting the prophets became a sort of central pillar of the way the early story was told. This is not only in the prophet's time in Medina, in the biographies, but even the accounts of his birth. There's stories, narrations about Jews from Medina knowing that a prophet was going to come from the south, that is from Mecca. So I just think that that was, a really central way in which the early biographers began to tell the story. And they did tell stories about Christians as well, but they told stories in a way that Christians tended to be not in Mecca or Medina. So you have the delegation that came from Najran. You have the first hijrah in which Muslims went to Ethiopia. So they found a way to have the early community engage with Christians, but in a way that had them sort of on the periphery, and generally, by the way, in a positive way. Both those two stories, the Najran community and the Ethiopia community, Christians are looking good.
You argue that the novelty of the Quran's message is above all rooted in the Arabic language and the introduction of a new prophet. Could you explain how you reached this conclusion? And does it mean that, in your view, the Quran was intended only as a scripture for Arabic speakers?
Yeah, great question. So I think Arabic is super important and really, really interesting in thinking through the Quran. Uh, I mean, I do think that um, there is a particular concern for the Quran's author to emphasize and celebrate its Arabic language. And there are references in the Quran which explain the importance of the Arabic language as uh, the Quran being able to guide a community that speaks Arabic. I mean, that probably sounds simplistic, right? But when you look at the linguistic background, which I'll get to in a second, it's actually a really interesting point, right? So Quran says, I think it's in Surah Ash-Shura 42, we have revealed it to you in an Arabic tongue that you might warn the people of the cities and those around it. The Quran in, I think, Surah 46 says, this is a book which confirms in the Arabic tongue. There's a famous verse which says, we know that they say some human is informing the prophet, but his tongue is Ajami, which probably means foreign, whereas this is in Arabic. This is in pure Arabic. So, yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. All of that sort of rests on the really important and beautiful point of the Quran, which is, why does God go through the trouble of sending a revelation at all? I mean, I don't need to tell you or your audience this kind of like Islam 101, right? But the whole point of divine revelation is God loves people. He seeks to guide them. He seeks their welfare. He wants them to be saved and rewarded in paradise. And so he communicates to them. And in this case, he wants to communicate to them in a way that they could understand. I mean, it's kind of theological, right? But like this Arabic word tabligh, like this is the whole point, that you can understand what God is saying so that you reflect upon it and become a believer and be saved. So yeah, so there's this celebration of the Arabic language for that purpose. Now, just one thing on kind of the linguistic stuff in the background. As you no doubt know, the Quran is the first book in Arabic. Maybe we could circle back, I guess, to pre-Islamic poetry, Jahili poetry, but in terms of any documentary evidence, it is the first book in Arabic. We have no documentary evidence of a Bible translated into Arabic before Islam. All of those translations take place in the Islamic period as a response to the Arabization of the Middle East in places like Palestine and Syria. So that just means that like something new is happening here. Now God is speaking. I mean, I believe there were Christians around, right? But they were having to deal with scripture in probably Syriac, mostly maybe Greek or Ethiopic. So they're always dealing with God's word in another language. And now the Quran can quite, proudly and justifiably say, listen, here's God's word in your language. However, there are definitely elements in the Quran which make universal claims. I mean, there's no question about that. So, all of the verses which address Ahl al-Kitab, the Quran, yeah, there's stuff which says your God and our God is one, but the overwhelming message of those addresses to Ahl al-Kitab, people of the book, is inviting them also to Islam. So certainly the universal element is important.
Okay.
You posit that the Quran uses Jesus primarily as a polemical spokesperson for its theological arguments about God and Muhammad, obviously targeting Christians. Is this a different role in your view to the one ascribed to other prophetic figures in the text? Does Jesus stand out in comparison?
I think so. Yeah. But I wouldn't Christianize the Quran. So, I mean, people might see the title of the book and they'll think, oh, Reynolds, he's a Christian. And so he's arguing the Quran is like secretly Christian. There's actually plenty of people who have argued that. Yeah, my argument is not that the Quran is actually sort of teaching sort of Christian ideas about Jesus. Actually, I think the role that Jesus plays in the Quran is principally to challenge Christian ideas about Jesus. So I mean, one basic point is there's almost nothing that Jesus says in the New Testament which is found in the Quran. I mean, you can maybe argue there's a place where he says, uh, Allah is my Lord and your Lord. Is kind of close to something in the Gospel of John. But even there, you kind of have to, stretch things a bit. Like there's basic, like the Beatitudes, they're not in the Quran. The long discourses, bread of life discourse or whatever, like the parables that Jesus says. Now, so that's really interesting, right? Because the Quran could have, I think, um, quoted Jesus saying stuff that's in the Gospels, uh, but it doesn't. So already that gives us a sign that the author is sort of very thoughtfully using the figure of Jesus. And, we have elements in the Quran where Jesus is sort of reprimanding Christians, usually not directly, but if you follow on the conversation that I alluded to earlier in Quran chapter 5, towards the end, where God and Jesus are speaking, in verse 117, Jesus sort of almost washes his hands of Christians. He says, well, first he says, I never would have said this sort of thing that, take me and my mother as gods. You would have known it if I said it. And then verse 117 says, I only said to them, basically, worship God alone. So, the Quranic author there, in my opinion, is, making a case, presumably for an audience that included Christians, for a new Jesus, a different Jesus. So this is this is higher stakes. Now, you could argue that with Moses, there's something going on that's similar. Yeah, so I think that might be right as well. So that would make maybe two figures that where there's kind of the stakes are higher because of the communities immediately around the Muslims. But it's not there with the other biblical figures. So yeah, maybe I should leave it at that so I don't just start rambling.
No, 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 no worries. Um, Another one of your central observations is how the Quranic text is frequently punctuated by biblical turns of phrases. Could you explain how the Quranic author employs these biblical formulas and whether you believe he was conscious of their specific textual sources?
Yeah, thank you. So this is the central pillar of the argument that there's a lot of these biblical turns of phrase in the Quran. And yet, like a key element or key point of evidence is that they're not used in the same way as they are in the Bible. So, and I'll explain why that's super important, at least for my argument. But just to give some examples, the Quran speaks of a camel passing through the eye of a needle. So that's a famous statement from the Synoptic Gospels. In the Gospels, it involves a rich man. Uh, I'm going to embarrass myself by not getting exactly right, but basically, a rich man will not enter into heaven before, or no, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than a rich man to enter into heaven, right? In the Quran, I think it's in sort of seven odd off. It involves instead someone who denies God's signs. The Quran has an example of something very small in order to sort of illustrate God's microscopic knowledge of all of our inner thoughts and things. It speaks of a mustard seed. Again, this is found in the Gospels, but it's used differently in the Gospels. It's used as an example of the kingdom of God, which starts from a little bit of faith and then flowers into this great tree. So, what would this mean if these kinds of turns of phrase are in the Quran but used in a different way? I mean, from my take, it shows that it was just the way people were speaking in that context. Like an atheist today in the UK or the US, might say, "Oh, that's a good Samaritan over there," right? Because somebody did something nice. Or they might say, "Oh, didn't you see the writing on the wall?" They may not even be aware that the Good Samaritan is in the New Testament and the writing on the wall is from, like Nebuchadnezzar and stuff in the Old Testament. It's just how people speak in the UK or the US. And I think it was a similar context, sorry, not similar context. There's something analogous that was going on in the context of the early Islamic community where biblical language was in the air. And to me, that's a sign. And notice the two examples I gave, mustard seed and the camel in the eye of the needle. These are New Testament turns of phrase. So it's signs of sort of Christian biblical language in the air.
Yeah, and why would you use Christian phrases to non-Christians or those that might, well, maybe Jews could have been familiar with these phrases as well, but still the argument stands, why would you use these kind of phrases if the audience weren't Christian of some sort?
Yeah, totally. Like that's kind of, in the cultural language, in a way, yeah, that is kind of analogous, I think, in Europe or the US in the 21st century, where like it's just, people may not be super religious when they're referring to prodigal son or whatever, but it's just like it's been sort of part of our cultural context, this biblical background.
Mm.
And in your analysis of the Quran's engagement with biblical tradition, you highlight that all it does include questions of like law and eschatology and
Mhm.
ritual.
Mhm.
It really shows a particular interest in stories or legends. What do you think is the source for this real hyper focus on narrative and this kind of notable disinterest in other biblical textual genres? I mean, you already mentioned that, for example, the Beatitudes and other aspects of Jesus preaching are missing.
Yeah, great question. So, yeah, um, I mean, maybe the best way to answer Roxana for me, is to think about the nature of the Quranic text. And it's important to remember, and I think it's actually missed in a lot of kind of university-based scholarship on the Quran. So just it's important to keep in mind that the Quran is an exceptional book in literary terms, right? It has 114 surahs. These are often referred to as chapters, which is fine. Like we have to have ways of speaking about stuff, but they're not really chapters, right? Like at least in normal everyday English, when you say chapter of a book, you're thinking of like, I don't know, Pride and Prejudice or Tale of Two Cities or something. You work through a book and chapter one leads into chapter two. There might even be a cliffhanger at the end of chapter one, right? This is not what's going on in the Quran, in my opinion. There are some scholars out there who try to show the coherence of the sequence of the surahs. Uh, and then another important point is, of course, that the Quran rhymes. And again, keep in mind, especially for listeners, who are not kind of familiar with the Quran or coming from an Islamic background, um, the verses in the Quran are organic to the text. It wasn't that someone arbitrarily decided where to put verses, although there is some difference historically about verse division. But the rhyme itself marks a verse. Right? This is different from the Bible, with the exception maybe of the Psalms, where verses are just put there for the convenience of the believing community, right? So the author is writing a text which rhymes. It has these different units which can kind of stand on their own, the surahs. And to me, both of those features sort of signal an interest in producing a scripture for a believing community, which would serve the purpose, on the one hand, of sort of inculcating or instilling certain norms or values, which could be theological or could be ethical. But then on the other hand, as serving as a scripture for the community to worship God with, right? Like, one of the other basic Islamic ideas is God has given us the Quran not only for sort of, as we were saying before, tabligh, not only to give us information, but also that we would have a way to worship him, right? By reciting the Quran. By the way, with the Psalms parallel is very interesting here. We could circle back to that maybe. So, when it comes to narrative, uh, I mean, the Quran itself generally has a very distinct style with its narrations, as you know, where there's not a lot of details, names, geography, chronology. It's the narrative is sort of organically part of this sort of liturgical, stylistic rhetoric of the text. Um, yeah, and but that kind of works. Whereas to engage with law or that sort of, let's say, like ritual guidelines and things, there's definitely some of that in the Quran, especially in the Medinan sections. But that's even a bigger challenge for an author. As a non-Muslim, for me, it's human author, so like it's already extraordinary that you can have like the story of Joseph in a rhymed format, right? In a surah. But then to give legal instructions for the community, and obviously you have some of that, yeah, it's a bigger challenge. Now, just last thing is, of course, there are other scholars who have really worked through the Quran's legal material and its relation to biblical scholarship. Holger Ellington, maybe you had him on, or probably know his work. He's done a lot of that. Joseph Lowry as well.
What critical observations do you think that previous critical scholarship on the Quran's way of adapting these biblical narratives misses? How do the premises of your book provide a new perspective on these stories that have been discussed so much previously?
Yeah, thank you. So, to me, sort of the fatal flaw of early Western scholarship on biblical material in the Quran is to sort of deprive the Quranic author of any agency,
Mm.
right? So, I've been guilty of this too, by the way. So, like one of the first books I wrote was Quran in its and its biblical subtext. I should know my own titles. And its biblical subtext. And I really do a lot of that there. I would write that book differently today. But I was kind of, I don't know, in some ways imitating earlier scholars how they do this. So they would say, oh, there's something different in the way the Quran, for example, speaks about Joseph. I mentioned Joseph earlier. So Joseph, Old Testament Joseph, it has his father Jacob from the beginning, like, know that the brothers are plotting against Joseph and even warns him that they're going to plot against him, right? And then they come with a bloody shirt, and he even knows that, the Quran says I think, common translation is there was sham blood on the shirt, right? So these elements of the Joseph story, they're not found in Genesis, where we have the Joseph story. So scholars are like, oh, so we have Genesis, and then we have Quran 12, and we have all these differences. So we need to find something in between Genesis and the Quran. So let's look through Talmud, let's look through Midrash, let's look through the Syriac authors, and we'll try to find sources which explain why you have this unique telling of the Joseph story. And I mean, that works actually very important, the sort of source criticism, but it doesn't really take into consideration the possibility that the Quranic author has his own theology, his own agenda too, that might respond not just to theology, but to sort of like what was going on in his society, like social, cultural, like the development of the community, right? And so that for me, that's at least in 2026, that's like my biggest concern with the traditional way of dealing with biblical material in the Quran. I think we should always keep in mind what is the goal of the Quranic author in telling this biblical story in a certain way.
With that in mind, one of the stories in particular that is obviously central to the Christian story is the story of Mary and Jesus,
Mhm,
the birth story in Surah 19.
mhm,
What do you think are the Quran's theological motivations for significantly reshaping that story? For example, why is Joseph erased? and Mary depicted as giving birth in solitude. Why were those
Yes,
changes made, do you
yes,
think?
yes. Wonderful. Yeah, great. So I feel pretty confident in one part of my answer, and a little bit less confident in the second. So, to me, so this episode, this really interesting episode of Quran 19, where, as you mentioned, you have this significant departure from the Gospel of Luke, but also all the other early Christian texts which speak about the Nativity. Uh, Namely, Mary, gives birth to Jesus alone, without Joseph, not in the city of Bethlehem, but what's called a remote place. And she's almost immediately confronted by her. It's hard to know that we don't have sort of indications of time, but it feels like almost immediately confronted by her people who insinuate that she's guilty of fornication. And that leads into the short sort of sermon or homily of the infant Jesus. I mean, most Muslim interpreters say he's an infant, and his speech there is miraculous, in part because there's references to Jesus speaking in the cradle in Quran 3 and I think Quran 5. So, yeah, so that little sermon of the infant Jesus is a sort of important argument about his nature. It begins by saying, I am the servant of God, Abdullah. And then and then here's the second part, he also explicitly defends his mother. So, in fact, Mary is said to vow a sort of fast of silence. So when her people challenge her, she doesn't give a justification that she has had this child, maybe out of wedlock. It's you don't. I mean, Joseph is not mentioned, but he's also not denied. But she doesn't give an explanation. She points to the child, and the child, I think it's barran bi walidati. So I've come to justify the innocence of my mother, and to be faithful to her. So, I mean, I think that episode is sort of the climax of the story where the infant Jesus is made to sort of proclaim his nature as a servant. So there's a message there for Christians, in my opinion. Other scholars disagree. Guillaume D has worked on this, and he feels like this section is basically Christian. I don't think so. I think that's the point, to have Jesus, even from his infancy, acknowledge that he's not the divine Son of God. The bit I don't feel totally confident about is there is apparently a concern with that whole question of accusations against Mary for fornication, right? So that episode really, like, that's in sort of the development of the plot. That's where the tension is. It looks like she has been guilty of fornication. That's how things usually work. They speak, yeah, Ukht Harun, they speak to her, family was not like this. You even have a reference in Quran 4 where there's a sort of word buhtan, which seems like the Jews, they're accused of some sort of calumny or accusation against Mary. Now, it's possible that there is an engagement with the Jewish Christian polemics around the figure of Mary. I don't know the scholarship very well, but there's, this very complicated bits in the Talmud. They kind of use strange language and stuff, but there seems to be insinuations against Mary. And so possibly there's a response to Jews around the community that were seen as having an antagonistic approach to Mary.
You highlight several verses that you argue demonstrate that the Quran favors Christians over Jews as a group.
Mhm,
What
mhm,
social or theological reasons do you believe
mhm.
motivated this commendation or favoritism?
Yeah, that's really interesting point. I mean, the famous episode or passage is Quran 582, where the Quran explicitly says those who are most severe in opposition to the believers are the Jews and the mushrikun, maybe polytheists. We get back. And those who are closest to the believers in friendship is really, I mean, like, if you just take that passage, which in Christian Muslim dialogue is what people generally do, if you just focus on that passage, it's really beautiful. He uses this word mawadda, which is love. It's not just, respect, right? So those who are closest to believers in love are, it says those who say we are Christians, but are the Christians. So yeah, that's pretty impressive there. Um, yeah, I'd also note that we have this passage in Surah Al-Hajj, Quran 22. I forget the verse, 40s, maybe somewhere in the 40s, where the Quran says basically if people hadn't defended um, the believers, then religious buildings would have been threatened. And then it goes on and it names, in addition to Muslim religious buildings, probably it refers to bia, which are churches, and then it refers to this difficult word sawame, usually translated as monasteries. And then there's a third word there, which is salawat. And it comes from salat. So it comes from the word for prayer. A lot of English translations, they're just put in synagogues and they're following the tafsir, right? For a classical mufassir, it makes sense. A reference to churches, so the Christians are covered. So this word salawat probably means a Jewish place of worship, so synagogues. But the word doesn't mean synagogue. It means a place of prayer. So I tend to think all three of these are references to Christian buildings. So you have, churches and then monasteries and then probably the place where Christians pray. I mean, that's just interesting. It's interesting that the typical way to translate today is to kind of make Jews equal to Christians in the Quranic view by inserting synagogues there. Uh, I think it's a wrong approach. And it's interesting to me that the Quran really praises Christian buildings there. So, yeah, I mean, there's more than this too. I mean, it comes through in the Quran generally, like the passage that I began with, where it says that Christians are friends. It continues by saying, when they hear what was revealed to the prophet, their eyes fill with tears. So we have this reference to Christians, praying because they crying because they recognize the truth of the prophet's revelation. Yeah, this is a major theme, I think, in the Quran. The Quran is very harsh language against the Jews, which we could speak about more. Yeah, I mean, I think this is because there were significant numbers of Christians that joined the early believing community of Muslims. Um, Now, does this mean Jews were not converting to Islam? Possibly. I mean, one can make the argument sort of based on parallel cases in history that it's harder to convert a Jew than a Christian. It's kind of tough. Like, how do you actually evaluate that, right?
Yeah.
That's possible. But it's also possible that the Quran is sort of engaging with the Christian tradition in late antiquity of writings against the Jews. So this is really, really prominent in the Syriac fathers. We could speak about it more. I don't want to go on forever, but I mean, a way in which Syriac fathers articulated their teaching on Christ was to speak a lot about all the ways in which God showed to the Israelites that he was going to send a Messiah, and then when the Messiah came, that he was the Messiah. And nevertheless, they, because of their hard-heartedness, they didn't recognize him. So this is an important tradition in the Eastern Church in late antiquity, and it's possible the Quran is sort of engaging with that.
One of the many fascinating passages in your book is your analysis of Surah Al-Fatiha and how, despite
Mhm.
not containing any explicit references to Christianity, it does contain verses that seem to be written with the Christian community and theology in mind. Could you explain how your interpretation sort of reframes the opening surah as a response to Christians? And do you believe it establishes the Quranic message as inherently supersessionist from the get-go?
Wow. Okay. That's a really important and difficult question. It's kind of Roxanne, it's one of these issues where I feel like bad about the stuff I write and argue. Like I'm trying to follow the evidence and sort of, say things as I see them, but it's like running against really well-meaning ideas. So like, lots of people have criticized, for example, the English translation of Hilali and Khan. who translate this line at the end of the Fatiha, they add in parentheses that those upon whom, well, those who are astray, the Daleen, those are the Christians, and those upon whom there's anger are the Jews. And a lot of people push back, at least in kind of dialogue circles in the West, and they say like it's a terrible translation. Quran is not being anti-Jewish or anti-Christian. Listen, this is like the fundamental prayer of Muslims. It's al-Fatiha. It's part of, all of the salat. Like this is not acceptable to understand it in this way, right? And then I come along and be like, well, actually, maybe Lali Khan are right here. Yeah, I mean, there's no way to know. I probably don't have compelling evidence, but this root, Ghain, Dad, Ba, Ghadab, anger, it is associated with the Israelites a lot. So it's kind of like, the Quran, in my mind, like follows some of this notion of salvation history, and the Israelites become a really important example of God showing favor to people, guiding people. He was not obliged to send them these prophets. He was not obliged to give them miracles, right? So this is kind of like the theological messaging here. He did this out of his superabundant mercy, and nevertheless, not only did they reject the prophets, the Quran says they killed the prophets, right? So this is like, it's just an intense sort of, I don't know, theme in the Quran. So I think that shows through probably at the end of Surah Al-Fatiha. And then I think it kind of works to have, the Dalin or the Dalun be the Christians. Al-Fatiha is extraordinary surah, as you know. It's the first surah, 7 verses. It includes one of the very few places in the Quran where we have, the believer speaking, invoking God. Very interesting, right? So God guide us, so the believer speaking to God. Um, and at the end of Al-Fatiha, it specifically says, do not guide us in the way of group A and group B. It could be that I'm totally wrong, and group A and group B are just kind of general ethical categories. Uh, but to me, it's at least plausible that there's an allusion specifically to the groups that presented the major challenge to the early believing community of Muslims, which quite possibly saw itself still as sort of endangered, fragile. These were the threats, the other monotheistic groups out there.
And what historical evidence do you think best supports the conclusion you draw from the Quranic text that Christianity predominated in Arabia by the time of the Prophet, including the Hijaz? Do you think recent epigraphic discoveries successfully overturn Aziz al-Azmai's view that the Hijaz was a pagan reservation, or Stephen Shoemaker's position that it was a Christian-bearing milieu?
Yeah, 100%. So yes, definitely. It's not just the evidence of the Quran itself, because so Stephen Shoemaker will say, yeah, okay, Reynolds, like there's obviously lots of stuff about Christians and Christianity in the Quran, but what if the Quran actually was composed, up towards Palestine or something, right? So, yeah, I mean that's reasonable. At least, if just that part of the argument is reasonable. But what we're finding, thanks to Ahmed al-Shaled and Haytham Sidki, and all these Saudi guys going out in jeeps, on the weekends looking for inscriptions, is that we have a growing corpus of these monotheistic inscriptions from the fifth, sixth, and early seventh century in this well, basically in the Arabic script, right? So scholars like to call it Paleo-Arabic. It's basically the Arabic script. Everything, it's open to correction, but I believe every Paleo-Arabic inscription that has been found that has any sort of, I don't know, declaration of religious anything is monotheistic. We don't have pagan Paleo-Arabic scripts. I mean, some may be nondescript, so I guess it could be pagan. Some of them are explicitly Christian. They have crosses. Also, Leila Nami has worked on this. I just read an article by the French scholar Christian Robin yesterday in which he is discussing Greek inscriptions. This kind of blew my mind. I should have known about this, but Greek inscriptions in southern Arabia, one of which has a cross and is clearly a Christian Greek inscription. So, yeah, I think more and more of these inscriptions are showing us that Arabia was overwhelmingly monotheistic and principally Christian.
Well, just a little pushback against
Sure,
that.
sure. Yeah.
Al-Jalal, whose epigraphic discoveries, obviously you just mentioned and you really cite heavily in your book, has highlighted that the inscriptions found in the Tabuk religion, as well as on the region of Mecca and Al-Taif, present a very neutral monotheism with no clear symbols of Judaism or Christianity, and were authored by men bearing pagan names like Abd al-Uzza, for example. And he argues that epigraphic evidence appears to favor the interpretation of Patricia Crone regarding the religion of the Mushrikun, namely that they were a syncretic belief system in which lesser supernatural beings played an necessary role, but they were not explicitly affiliated Jews and
Mhm,
Christians.
mhm.
How would you respond to the view that a lot of these inscriptions just indicate the spread of this sort of undetermined, unaffiliated monotheism that was not necessarily Christian or was a form of syncretic sort of henotheism?
Yeah, terrific. So, I mean, Ahmad Jalad, Al-Jalad is the master. So really, I shouldn't say anything, especially because many of these inscriptions he's worked on, some of them he's discovered himself. So, I don't know, it'd be like challenging LeBron to a game of horse or something. I probably shouldn't do it. Or no, I should say, who's the great shooter for the Sacramento? Anyway, you get the point. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, first of all, on nondescript monotheists, like who are the who are these what is this nondescript monotheism like? I mean, I guess I've met nondescript monotheists, like here in Indiana, somebody will say probably in the UK, whatever. People say, yeah, okay, I'm spiritual, not religious. Like, I think there's a force behind everything. But that's different than what's being posited for Arabia based on Patricia Crone, right? So, like, someone who says today, like, yeah, I believe in God, but I don't really identify with an organized religion, like, very kind of Gen Z thing to say, at least in the West, right? Like, this is someone coming out of a principally Christian culture in the West, right? Who's kind of responding to that. It's kind of a stage two kind of thing. Um, if we look in antiquity and late antiquity, people are part of a community. It's Jews, Christians, and then Muslims. They may disagree. They might be a Christian who's like, actually, I disagree with doctrine X or doctrine Y or whatever. So I find a much more compelling way of explaining apparent divergences from sort of traditional Christian doctrine and the inscriptions, or even just sort of the bland monothe So, like Ahmed Jalad, he'll note that the sorts of language in these inscriptions, like one of the roots that appears there a lot is baraka. So, barakaf, which is kind of very Christian, it's also very Quranic language, blessing, so that language will be there. There's a lot of language about remember, dhakara, like that's there a lot. Again, very Quranic, but it seems very general, right? So to me, it's just like a better, the more fitting and attractive explanation is to just say, like, a Christian doesn't always have to be like Jesus is a savior in things they write, like I often say, like, as a Christian, I just be like, God bless you to someone sneezes, I'm like, God bless you. I'm not like, may Jesus save you or something. So to me, that's more interesting. And also, just one or two thoughts. I mean, these are not really sequential or logical, but if you'd like, we could speak about this language of mushrikun in the Quran. So a lot of people assume, because the Quran does identify in verses that mention Christians and Jews, It then mentions mushrikun. And so people read this as sort of proper nouns identifying three coherent religious groups. So I kind of disagree with that. Also, I mean, it's important to keep in mind, but I won't say anything about this right now, that just because you're a member of a group doesn't mean you articulate the official doctrine of your group lucidly or whatever in an orthodox manner. Jack Tanus has written a lot about that.
Just in terms of the mushrikun, you
Mhm.
you argue that the Quran, the reported speech that the Quran attributes to
Mhm.
that group is not historical speech, and that
Mhm.
it does not demonstrate that the Quran's author was debating or interacting with real life polytheists
Mhm.
in its immediate community.
Mhm.
But you do use the reported speech that the Quran attributes to Christians to argue the reverse and present it as evidence that the Quran was not engaging with Christianity in the abstract, but with real historical Christians in
Mhm.
its own
Mhm.
community.
Mhm.
So, can you explain how you make that distinction? What differences between the way these two groups are quoted lead you to believe that one was a sort of rhetorical literary construct and the other was a contemporary historical group?
Yeah, terrific. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think either the direct quotations or reported speech attributed to the mushrikun or that attributed to the Christians are verbatim quotations. I don't think the Quranic author means to make them verbatim quotations. I think it's pretty clear. I mean, basically, without exception, these are quotations of a group, right? So it's always a plural. So when the opponents of the Quranic community, when they speak, it's always a community speaking sort of in unison, like a chorus, right? So I mean, just the first thing that comes to mind with a Christian example, I think it's in Al-Baqarah, قال اليهود والنصارى نحن أبناء الله وأحباؤه. So the Jews and the Christians say, we are, quote, we are the sons of God and his beloved. So clearly, the author doesn't even mean for you to understand this as a
Mm,
literal verbatim quotation. Can we
mhm.
imagine the Jews and Christians all gathering together in a crowd and speaking those Arabic words together? The reported speech also rhymes. So, reported speech follows the Quranic rhyme. So, it's part of the message of the Quran. And in my opinion, the author's principal concern is to deliver that message to the audience, not to be a sort of newspaper reporter getting verbatim citations of what happened last Tuesday at 3 p.m. Someone said exactly this or that. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the starting point. Um, yeah, and so similarly, opponents who are cited, usually understood to be the mushrikun, of criticizing Muhammad. So, like for example, in the Nahl, that verse I alluded to earlier, where it says, they say he is only taught by a man. That is again, it's they. They say قال الذين كفروا, verses like that, which speak about what all of the kuffar say together. So, I mean, a lot has to be said about dealing with references to the mushrikun. But for me, the starting point, though, is a method of reading the text. For many scholars in the West, there's a tendency to approach the text as a sort of map of the characters that were really on the ground, a sort of transparent map. I don't know if that actually makes sense, but a map of characters on the ground in Mecca and Medina, where you can sort of use specific Arabic words in the Quran, almost like on a legend and a map. I think this metaphor is totally breaking down, but and actually identify them with real characters in Mecca. To me, I'm much more persuaded by the approach of Gerald Hotting in his book, The Idea of Idolatry, that we should be attentive to the literary qualities of the text.
So then how do you interpret the Quran's references to specific Arabian deities like Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat in light
Mhm.
of the available epigraphic evidence
Yeah, terrific. Yeah. So, right. So famously, we have, the three goddesses mentioned in Quran 53, some other references to pagan gods, probably in the chapter of Noah, And then you have different some ritual things too, which seem to be pagan rituals. I I don't think, Taryn, that I can probably convince most folks about this. Like in a sense, by focusing on a specific passage, I don't think I can win the argument, right? Because you just read like read the verse, even though I think it says alam tara, like do you not see? So there's this like you immediately reading that verse, you want to visualize what's going on, like what was going on that day. And then if you read the Sirah, if you read Ibn Hisham, his Sirah, he'll tell you what happened, on that day, the so-called satanic verses, all that stuff in there, and how they all sort of prostrated together because it was a concession to polytheism, all of this. And it's so satisfying. It's just so satisfying, right? So for me, it's the starting point is to sort of step back and kind of look at a larger vision of the text and the nature of the text, and the way in which the references to pagan deities and pagan things are part of the repertoire of the author to communicate his message, which is for the sake, ultimately, the author, like I speak about this with my kids about the Bible. I'm like, guys, do you actually think the biblical authors, their principal concern was to teach this point of history? Like, do you really think they want you to know that the Exodus took place at such and such year BC and that this is the exact number of people that left Egypt, right? And they're usually like, Dad, stop speaking about the Bible and theology. Can we speak about something else? So, but similarly, like the Quranic author's principal concern is to guide and save the audience. And so, part of the repertoire is speaking about these pagan deities or pagan traditions, which really were part of the heritage. These are not made up names, as you know, right? Like Alat and El-Uzza and Manat, I think especially Alat, they're found in the earlier inscriptions. They were part of in my understanding, earlier pagan world of Arabia.
Uh, just in terms of the way you're talking about the text as a literary text,
Mhm.
you state in your book in reference to the Quran that it is problematic to make historical inferences on the basis of a text that liberally employs like motifs for the
Mhm.
sake of
Mhm.
particular arguments. And you criticize other scholars for not primarily viewing the Quran as a literary text, which was formed
Mhm.
through significant editing and redaction and like you said, rhymes, etc. Does this mean that you believe it's impossible to infer any historical information about the Prophet and the events he experienced from the Quranic text? Does this render any meaningful historical critical biography for him hopeless academic project in your view?
I don't think so. No, I think you can do serious historical work on the Muhammad of history. Uh, I do think in this case it is informative to look at the work on the Jesus of history, historical Jesus, and how New Testament scholars work through this. Yeah, I think actually that's really key. Obviously, the sources are different, the whole time period is different, but just in terms of method, right? Like folks will often say, like, dude, you can't take a biblical studies approach to the Quran. They're different. And they just kind of say that, right? And they don't fully think through ways in which like an element of biblical studies could be useful. Like, let's sit down calmly, think through this. Like, what is the method in biblical studies? So, in thinking of the Jesus of history, obviously there are raging debates, right? Some people are much more conservative in the reading of the Gospels and Paul and the other New Testament stuff. Others are like highly revisionist or whatever. But like, the way that classically academic scholars, not talking about preachers now, right? Like academic scholars, biblical studies, all this, they would say like, okay, like just take Luke's gospel, kind of choosing at random. What we have is what Luke tells us. And they might even say like there's more than one source. Maybe it's not the historical Luke at all, but if we just say Luke, meaning the author of the third gospel, right? So like now Luke, whoever he was, is working probably in the 60s, 70s AD. He was concerned about things going on where he lived at that time, right? And so we just have to keep that in mind when we read his gospel, right? Like there's stuff going on, temple's destroyed AD 70. Most people think Luke was written after the destruction of the temple. This was a cataclysmic event. Anyway, I don't want to go on and on, right? But so that this would be like a form critical or redactional critical approach to the Gospel of Luke to get back to the historical Jesus from Luke's gospel. You have to do additional work, in understanding Luke for what it is, not seeing it as a simple sort of documentary report, like a newspaper report of Jesus walking in Samaria or Jericho or whatever. You just have to be sophisticated and careful. Um, but there's a good case to be made that there were eyewitnesses still around in Luke's day. So that's one factor he took into consideration, along with other factors, when he's writing his gospel. Similarly, with the Quran, I think that kind of form critical approach is really interesting. You have the event of Muhammad, absolutely a figure of history, definitely existed. The book in no way denies, Muhammad or says he's a myth or something, right? So you have the event of the prophet, his early community, and then you have the Quran. So, obviously this is a departure from standard Islamic and really from standard Western approaches, which, even like Angelica Neuwirth, for example, like her approach is to think of basically 610 to 632, like the development of the community, and the Quran reflects this. And if you're not thinking about what was going on in the community in the year, I don't know, 626 in Medina or 616 in Mecca, then your reading is going to be impoverished, right? But for me, the more interesting approach is this kind of form critical approach where you have what the Quranic author gives us, presents to us in this book, which is meant, among other things, for the prayer life of the community, and you take it for what it really is, and then use sophisticated tools. There were definitely eyewitnesses around in the day of the Quranic author, and do the best with that source to understand the Muhammad of history.
And you challenge the idea that the Quran should be read as like a transcript of
Mhm.
what the Prophet said in response to specific events occurring in his immediate community. But through this lens, how do you address verses that appear to allude to specific intertribal conflicts, battles, treaties, rulings that refer to like particular individuals, like the issue of Zayd's marriage or the
Mhm.
Prophet's
Mhm.
wives? Like
Mhm.
how do those verses make sense if this is a scripture that is redactional and created as a scripture for a community rather than a a somewhat of a resource to understand how the prophet interacted with specific events.
Right. Great point, Roxana. Yeah, thanks for that. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think uh, the Quranic author clearly is concerned with the formation of the early community, and above all, in making the case for those who are wavering or maybe considering converting that Muhammad truly was a prophet. I know I'm kind of starting from, a little bit far afield from your question, but I'll circle back to it. Right? It's worth keeping in mind that in the monotheistic world at the time, it's really shocking to come up with a claim of a new prophet. Right? Jews and Christians agreed, like prophethood in the sense of like a new revelation, it was over. Jews and Christians agree on this. Yeah, Christians, saw prophecy as a sort of gift of the Holy Spirit, but that basically meant the proclamation of the gospel in a charismatic way. Did not mean a new revelation, right? So everyone said prophethood was over, and then here comes this new community with the claim of a new prophet. So there's a lot of sort of arguing that must take place to sort of, make space for yourself. It's like, I don't know, another sports metaphor, like, if you live in Chicago and you're a Celtics fan, and you're at a bar or a cafe or whatever, you got to do a lot of arguing about why the Celtics are better than the Bulls or whatever. Like, you really have to be bold. You can't just be like, no, I really like the Celtics. So, I mean, I think that's sort of like part of the answer to the question in thinking about specific references in the text, to Zayd, as you mentioned, to the Prophet's wives in Surah At-Tahrim 66 and other places as well. It's in that light that I see even specific references. But by the way, Roxana, there really are not that many. I mean, it's actually sort of surprising how few characters contemporary to the Prophet are named. I mean, Zayd could be the only sort of friend or believer that's mentioned by named, and then, possibly Abu Lahab, if that's his name, would be a specific person who's a nemesis. There's not much more than that. So, yeah, I mean, I think what's the more interesting observation is that we don't have like, yeah, lots of details with character names and quotations from an individual person.
Okay, so despite agreeing with Shoemaker that the Quran underwent significant redaction, you state in your book that you disagree with his contention that significant Quranic texts were first composed in the post-prophetic context of Syrio-Palestine. Why do you believe that the Quran redaction most likely occurred in a Hijazi context and by its original author? And do you think there is a growing academic consensus in the field against Shoemaker's views that is now unlikely to be overturned?
So Shoemaker is like the favorite opponent of everyone in academic chronic
He's
studies.
like a supervillain within academia or
Yeah,
something.
100%. Yeah, so that like
In a good way, because I have his book, Creating the Quran, on my shelf. I enjoyed it for what it's worth. So it's not no attack using him as.
yeah, totally, totally. By the way, I respect so much Taryn and Roxana that like just this channel is just so terrific, engaging all points of view and like sets a tone for like serious and respectful conversation. Yeah, I'm so grateful that you have for this conversation, but also just like the general spirit of Skeps Islamica. Yeah, it's such a great resource. I should have said that at the opening, but maybe you could clip that out and use it as individual thing because like 100% it's just wonderful and it goes against like the whole culture of the internet and really academic chronic studies, which is just take people down.
Thank you.
Um,
Really appreciate that coming from you. That means
yeah,
a lot.
yeah, it's completely authentic and honest. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of the arguments that folks have made about the weakness of the case for like a Syro-Palestinian origin for the Quran bear repeating, right? Like there's no clear references to like a place in Palestine or Syria that like sort of seals the deal. If you're thinking of the Quran as many decades later, like a lot of people, I think Shoemaker supports this view of kind of in the days of Abd al-Malik, end of the 7th century, there's really not clear anachronisms that would put the Quran like many decades after the traditional dates of the Prophet's life. There's just not much there. I mean, just to remind people, like, I don't want to straw man Professor Shoemaker here, but like some of the points people make is, there's allusions to sites being near, close by. So famously, you have the reference in Quran 37 to apparently the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and it said you pass by them morning and night. Patricia Crone already made a lot about that. There's a reference, I think, in sort of the Room 30 to the battles between the Persians and the Byzantines being close by. If it's Persians, it doesn't say Persians, but if it's actually that, being close by. So there's some arguments you can make. Of course, Stephen also really interesting argument, I think, about the Kathisma Church, which is in Jerusalem, which he argues explains Quran 19. There's just nothing that seals the deal that makes you go to Syria or Palestine. And now that we're getting more and more monotheistic inscriptions in the heartlands of Arabia, you know, I think the burden of proof is on someone who wants to move the origins of Islam outside of the Hijaz.
Just to refer to another scholar who you cite in your book, and I know you're a huge admirer of Nicholas Sinai. Um, in his article, the Christian Elephant in the Meccan Room, he suggests that the Quran's inclusion of Christian stories and language can be explained by Christian missionary exposure rather than the Quranic milieu itself being heavily
Mhm.
Christianized.
Mhm.
Why do you not find Sinai's alternative hypothesis for the Quran's engagement with Christianity plausible?
Well, um, yeah, it's definitely what he argues there is definitely part of the picture in my mind. So, yeah, 100% there. There's good reason to believe that there was active missions among Arabic speakers. It's actually worth saying one or two things, and it's always bad to be on the other side of an argument with Nikolai Sinai. I'm still not sure if he's actually human. I mean, when you look at his key terms book, like, how does one human do this? Um, yeah, so I mean, what Christians did in late antiquity, but really in the whole history of the church, is preach the gospel. Like, this is the Christian thing, right? It's, also in Islam, dawah is what Muslims do. Like, one feels compelled by God to, a Christian would say, share the good news. A Muslim would say, I guess, invite others to the true religion. So this is what Christians did. There were just nonstop missions from the beginning. The Acts of the Apostles already talks about Paul and others, by the way, being sent out to different lands. We know in late antiquity, Christians went out to Africa. Ethiopian church is one of the earliest churches associated with the Apostle Mark, classically, along with Egypt. We know that entire scripts for languages, like Georgian, Armenian, later the Cyrillic script, which is used by the Slavic peoples. Those were created by missionaries in order to have sort of a tool in which to communicate to this people the Christian message. So yeah, that's definitely part of the story. By the way, it's possible. I think it's likely, though it's hard to prove, that that's the story of the genesis of the Arabic script as well, that it was tied into Christian missions. But setting that aside, yeah. But there's another part of the story, which is we just have clear references in my mind to living Christian communities. I mean, after all, we have this positive reference to monks and priests in Quran 582. If we look at the light verse, so Quran 24:35, I mentioned this in the book, in the verses which follow, there's a reference to this community of men who pray to God night and day, sorry, morning and night, and who are not distracted by tijara, but not distracted by commerce. It's possible that when you read those verses, so 24, kind of 36, 37, 38, and then you circle back to the light verse itself, which remember has this reference to a lamp in a niche. That could even be a description of sort of a monastic cell or a monastery. There's a lot more going on there. I mean, light verse is poetic and it's doing other things as well. Anyway, so we have these references to monasteries. I just think there's every reason to believe that there was a lived community, settled community of Christians in the Quran's environment.
Something that you just alluded to is that some of the debate between academics about Islamic origins can appear quite heated and personal,
Yeah.
with some aspersions being cast on motivations of those coming to different conclusions. Is this sort of discourse relatively common in academia, or is there something about the question of Islamic origins that produces particularly contentious dialogue?
I, I mean, I think it's probably everywhere in academia. I mean, the great thing about your channel is, you present different sides of the same issue. And yeah, I mean, the content you produce, because you're always so respectful, although you ask really serious questions, you sort of show the friendly. I don't know, do you ever see people taking down others on this channel?
We try not to do that.
Yeah, I mean, but in print, indefinitely on social media, there's a lot of straw manning, but above all, Roxana, like the most unfortunate bit is assuming people have ulterior motives. right? So like a Muslim or Muslim heritage scholar, like, oh, that's not a serious scholar. Like he's just doing dawah basically. His scholarship is flimsy. Don't take him seriously. And then someone who's Christian, like me, like, oh, he's just, there's just an agenda there, right? Like, um, why would a Christian doing Quranic studies or Islamic studies, I'm not saying, there may not, agenda is the wrong word, but, I'm not saying the person is not biased by his own background, but why would he be more biased than an atheist? Like, why would an atheist be better?
Mm,
So very often, folks out there on the internet are more comfortable. Like, if you have an atheist, like, guys, like a mulhid, that's not good in Islamic thought. Like, ilhad is bad, right? Like, uh, the Quran actually praises, it says that, Christians, Jews, and Muslims seems to say we worship the same God. What ilhad is terrible, but like the Christian has some agenda. Yeah, so this is though I think a kind of vibe that is in all of academia. Um, yeah, I don't know, have a really good analysis, but my folks in biblical studies say that people take each other down. My sense is it's probably just the nature of kind of this open discourse in which people can get ahead in their own career trajectory by making really strong arguments, taking people down, taking on sort of standard ideas about this or that. So there's probably like a positive feedback loop, right, where people are getting notoriety because they're really edgy and they keep on being more and more edgy.
all right. And thank you for your time. I mean, this has really been a phenomenal conversation, and your responses have been very insightful and interesting. So, this is our last question right here. How do you hope future scholarship in the field will further develop the arguments you made in your book? And are there any aspects of the relationship between Christianity and the Quran that remain an academic desideratum?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that question and for the whole discussion. I mean, I think one thing I would answer, although it's a bit like kind of coming from a different uh, a different element, uh, not directly hitting on your question, but for me, I'm really interested in the theology of the Quran as well. Like, as a believer. I'm really interested in thinking through, what is a human? And what does the Quran say about human? What makes a human different from non-human animals? So what is our understanding of the dignity of humans? What does Quran say about God and God's love and mercy for humans? How does God communicate that? Why is there evil? Like, why do we all suffer? Why are we all struggling with inner battles or whatever? So, yeah, I mean, it's not exactly your question, Taryn, but like I'm really actually really interested in those questions. In my teaching at Notre Dame, it's mostly theological. We're a Christian university, so I'm often speaking about those matters and not like the historical, critical stuff. Like, let's look at the etymology of this or that word. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's something that I personally I would like to continue to think about. I'm working on a book which basically holds up for Christians positive examples that Islam and Muslims have that can help them, Christians, in their faith life. In terms of like the more historical, critical, like philology things, I mean, there's just so much more to do. There are people on the ground doing the work with inscriptions, which is setting a foundation for us better to understand the religious milieu. And I would just say, maybe as a final thought, that like this sort of historical critical work that I try to model in this book, it in no way is sort of a threat to the belief of Muslims. Like, this is historical critical scholarship. It's just more data which the believer then can use or not in thinking through about God and God's relationship with the world. I love God, and my agenda is not like to undermine people's faith, just to provide more data. And if it's useful, great. And I'm sure a lot of stuff is wrong. So, apologies for that. And I'll take any criticism and move on from there.
All right. On that note, we thank you for being such a wonderful guest on our channel. And like you said, you're fans of what we do. We are a fan of what you do. I was already following your work even before you started your channel, and yeah, it's been such a pleasure having you on and watching your channel grow and all the work that you do. Is there anything that you would like to leave us before you take off? Any upcoming? You did kind of mention a publication you're working on, but any upcoming works that you have coming down the pipeline?
So that book, yeah, will be coming out sometime this year. It's called Islamic Lessons for Christians. And yeah, I mean, if people want to take a look at the channel exploring the Quran and the Bible, that'd be great. But keep listening to this channel too, and share it with your friends as well.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, and we hope to speak to you another time, but we'll definitely see you on social media.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thanks, Taryn. Thanks, Roxana.
Yep.